Hi, everyone. I have the amazing opportunity to interview Greg Koukl today. Greg Koukl is a well-respected apologist, somebody that I talk about often in my videos, and I recommend a lot of his work. Doreen, unfortunately, won't be able to join us for this interview today because she is working on her book. She is taking off this month to write it and take her time to focus on that. But before we get started, I wanted to say that Greg can be found at str.org. He also has a podcast that he does that you can find the app for in the App Store. You can find the Stand to Reason app there. He does amazing work there, answering questions, talking about controversial issues, things that you might find useful. Maybe you've asked these questions before. We are going to be talking about his book, Tactics, today. Everybody knows that I am always saying that there's a right and wrong way to approach people. We're going to talk about some of the things that he wrote in his book on how to approach people and how to witness to them in an effective way. I highly recommend that you go out and you get this book if you want to learn how to be an effective witness for Christ. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to have a guest on today that we've had on before that some of you are very familiar with. I talk about his work all the time, along with some other notable apologists that you all know that I love. Doreen is not with us today, but she's working on her book that she has a deadline on, that you all know that she's taking social media off for the month. But I would love to welcome a friend of ours and somebody who almost needs no introduction, Greg Koukl. Hi, Greg. Welcome on to the show today.
What a treat to be with you, Melissa. I miss Doreen. We had such a great time, the three of us, last time around. But
Yes.
I know she's working on something really important. So at least I'm glad to talk with you, and we still get to talk with her audience anyway. So
yeah, that's true. Yes. And we look forward to her book as well. When her book comes out, everybody will know. So
yeah.
Today we are talking about your book, Tactics. Greg, let me say, I talk about your book a lot. So my followers on my channel, on my social media, understand that I know and love this book because it gives people really practical ways to talk about their faith.
Right.
And this is the second edition. Okay. So we did this before we got on, but there's a lot more in this book. I was reading it and I'm like,
I have the same thing here, side by side. When I heft the second book, it just makes me feel good to feel that extra weight because there's so much more in it. You're right.
It's heavier. I have to say, I was reading it and I'm very familiar with it's been about 10 years or so since your first one.
This is the 10th anniversary edition right now.
Yes. And I was reading this and it felt like it was a different book. Like it felt like it was just brand new. It felt like there was a lot of new material, but there was also a way that you wrote it that seems very different too.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned that because I do mention this to other people, why the new book, because in the last 10 years, not only have I learned some more techniques and maneuvers that I wanted to include, but I've polished up my writing skills too. Hopefully I've improved in that. And so when I'm reading over the old text, I'm thinking, boy, why did I say it that way? Here's a better way to put it. Or I had just so much more I wanted to say about a particular topic that I expanded that material. So in the first edition, I talked about the concept, the contrast between harvesting and gardening, okay? But I mentioned it almost in passing in the first book. And in the last 10 years, this has become a vital foundational element for the tactical game plan, to understand that we are not trying to worry about harvesting. We are trying to do the gardening that's necessary for the harvest in the long run. And this has transformed people. I watch their faces, and when I explain the notions, they say, well, I can do that. I can get off the bench and get in play in a way that's comfortable for me. So I expanded that tremendously. And there's lots of places like that where I just felt, I need to say more about this because I've learned more about it, and maybe that's why it seems like a different book, because in many ways it is 40% more material in the new book than in the older one.
Well, I feel it, that's for sure. I wanted to ask you a question about harvesting and gardening, but first I want to tell you guys, there are books, y'all know the books that I recommend, and I think that there's a bundle of books that every Christian needs to have on their bookshelf. This book, you guys, is really where I have gotten a lot of the ways that I approach people. are grounded a lot in where Greg goes in his book. I first got started in counter cult ministry, and there was a really tactical way to talk to, like, say, a Jehovah's Witness. And I didn't realize I would be using the Columbo technique. I didn't realize that I was putting a stone in their shoe. All these things, all these methods that I was using, I didn't realize were already, in existence, described and talked about here in this book. So I just kind of want to throw that out there, guys. You really should consider getting this book, as it's a great Christmas present. I looked it up on Amazon. It's got fantastic reviews. I think that you can grab it off Amazon. Is that correct, Greg?
Yeah, you can. And in fact, I just checked, authors do that. And I've got 40 reviews so far, and every one of them is 5 stars. Every single one of them. The old book is still a good book, as you know. But there's so much more in the new one that I just strongly recommend the new one, because it'll make a bigger difference in your life. And especially in this area of making clear the distinction between gardening and harvesting, that I see as a predicate to the whole process. It's a way of looking at evangelism that allows you to use the game plan more effectively.
Well, let's break that down a little bit, Greg. There's a lot in your book that we could go over and discuss. But one of my favorite things is I love the Columbo tactic.
Right.
We can talk about that.
That's the basic game plan, right?
Yes. But I also love how you break down the harvesting and the gardening. Some people are harvesters. Some people are gardeners. What does that mean?
Well, the backstory is important. I became a Christian 46 years ago during the Jesus movement in Southern California. And back then, witnessing was pretty straightforward. You give the simple gospel, you answer some simple questions, and you pray. And people would become Christian, So times have changed, though, as you know. Well, you're still kind of young, so times have changed. I'm just telling you, for one of the old guys here. And so it's not so simple anymore. And the gospel is still the gospel, of course, but people don't understand the notions that undergird Christianity that was common knowledge then. And so a lot of times people's view of the gospel is that it's bad news, not good news, because they don't understand it. They don't like Christianity. They don't like the restrictions. Okay, so I realized that over the years I began to change my approach, but most Christians hadn't. We are still kind of stuck with a method of presenting the gospel that is harvest oriented. Let's witness to others and try to get them to receive Christ. Let's try to close the deal. There's the emphasis on that. Now, the problem with that is a lot of people aren't in that spot. Okay, they need a lot more of what Francis Schaeffer used to call pre-evangelism. Okay, and not only that, if Christians were expected to pressure for a decision, well, they're not going to do it. It's too scary. It sounds like fighting words, and they're going to sit on the bench and be out of play. And that's where a lot of Christians are. They know they ought to engage more, share their convictions with other people more consistently, but they're just frightened to do it, and they just don't want to get into that mess. And so they just stay on the sidelines and don't engage. Okay, so I'm reading in John chapter 4, and there is Jesus talking to the woman at the well. After that famous incident, he talks to the disciples, and he says to the disciples, "You are about to harvest where you did not sow." Because as the saying goes, one sows, the other reaps. You're going to reap where you did not sow. Those are his words. And basically he's saying, look, somebody else did the heavy lifting here. You're going to get the easy pickings, all right? But notice the calculus there in that statement. He's saying that there's basically one field. In that case, it was Sychar in Samaria. He says there's one field there, but there are two seasons in that field. There is a reaping season, but there's a sowing season too, okay? And therefore, there are two kinds of workers. There are sowers and there are reapers, or what I call gardeners and harvesters, because the truth is, before there can be any harvest, there always has to be a season of gardening. Let me say that again because it's so important. Before there can be any harvest, there always has to be a season of gardening. And you can think of your own life. I think of mine even almost half a century ago. Nobody comes to Christ in a snap anymore. ever, really. It takes a while for them to think about the issues and to be disabused of their bad ideas and consider better ideas, the gospel, for example. And once that work is done well, once the fruit is ripe, it just drops into the bucket, Melissa. It's easy to harvest ripe fruit. The hard work is in the gardening. And if the hard work is in the gardening, probably God is going to position more people as gardeners than as harvesters. But our approach is a harvest-oriented approach. And so what I'm trying to do is help people to see the importance of gardening and give them the freedom to just garden without, in a sense, going to the gospel and trying to close the deal. So I'm going to say something right now that is going to really stun a lot of people. And I've only begun saying this publicly in the last 3 or 4 months, but it's going to be mainstay of this talk.
Okay.
Here it is. I have not prayed with someone to receive Christ in over 30 years, maybe longer. And I know what a lot of people are thinking. What a loser, that's so lame. And the reason is because I look at my life and I realize I'm a gardener. I'm not a harvester. It's not what I do. My public speaking, my writing, my radio show, all of that really is just gardening, a little here, a little there, a little here, a little there, just tilling, planting, watering, fertilizing. But I'll tell you a secret. I don't know. You know who J. Warner Wallace is, right?
Yeah, his book's on my shelf. We interviewed him too.
Okay, so your audience knows J. Warner Wallace, okay?
Yes, sir.
The famous cold case detective who applied his skills as an atheist to the Gospels, became a Christian, and then an apologist and a best-selling author.
Yes, sir.
Jim was in my garden. As an atheist, Jim was listening to my radio show before he became a Christian.
I think either you mentioned that before or he did, but that does sound familiar.
Yeah. Some of your listeners might know Abdul Murray, who is a former Muslim that became a Christian and is now the senior vice president at Ravi Zacharias International Ministries.
Yeah.
Abdul Murray, while he was still a Muslim, was in my garden. He was listening to my radio show. Okay. Now, you know what happened? Somebody came into my garden and they harvested my crop.
They stole your tomatoes.
That's right. That's right. Get out of my garden. No, I don't care. We're all on the same team. 2 seasons, 2 kinds of workers, the same team. And Jesus said this in John 4, so that the one who reaps and the one who sows can rejoice together.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
I my own conversion story can kind of be summed up with that too, is that it wasn't an overnight thing, but it was for me, but it built up to that.
Yeah.
And it's the Holy Spirit.
That's the key. Well, that's the key. That's the key. And so, by the way, I've had quite a number of people who've told me the same thing. I started listening to you, reading your stuff, whatever, when I was still an atheist or a non-believer, and little by little by little, then they became Christians. Somebody else might have been there for that event. I wasn't there. Fine. I don't mind. And so the reason I mentioned about J. Warner Wallace and Abdul Murray and the others is not to, wave my flag. That's not my point. My point is, it has to do with the way God works in these situations. You have no idea when you're planting those seeds, if you will. I use the term put a stone in their shoe. I like that better because it means like annoys them. I want to annoy them. I want to annoy them in a good way is what I tell my secular audiences. I'm not here to convert you, I tell them. I said, I just want to annoy you a little bit. They all start laughing because they expect the Christian to annoy them. But I say, but you'll thank me when I'm done, because I want you to. I hope I get you thinking about Jesus. So that's the whole notion here. And here's what I've seen happen. If you could stand on the stage with me while I'm speaking about harvesting and gardening, and I'm telling Christians that they don't have to get to the foot of the cross in every encounter. That's not my goal. Jesus didn't even do that, for goodness sake. But they could just do some gardening, put a stone in someone's shoe, and that's where the game plan comes in. The look on their faces, I know what they're thinking. They're thinking, I can do that.
Yeah.
I can do that. And this gets them off the bench and into the field to do some gardening. And when you got lots of gardeners, you got a bigger harvest. That's the key.
It's like,
And the
how do you
good,
eat an elephant, you know? One spoonful at a time. You don't eat the
oh,
whole.
that's right. One bite at a time.
Yeah.
That's right. I'm with you, and if you got a whole bunch of people chewing on the elephant, it goes down a lot quicker. Same idea here.
Yeah.
The idea that we have lots of players in the field, and if they could just get off the bench, if we gave them a way to get off the bench and into play, then they're going to do it. And this is exactly what I've seen. And you made a really important observation, Melissa, just a bit ago, and that is that some of the things you read about in the book, you realized you were actually doing.
Yeah.
But you didn't realize that they were called what I call them, putting a stone in the shoe of the Columbo tactic.
It came very naturally.
Yeah, which shows that a lot of these notions are not highfalutin, they're not fancy schmancy moves. They're basic common sense things that people have been using for a long time. What I did is I just tried to put it in an orderly fashion so people could make use of it more effectively. That's it.
Yeah. And there's no bigger fan of that than me. I have to tell you, I got into ministry in 2011. And it was counter cult ministry to Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. And one of the first things I ever had to go over with other Christians, because I taught basically how to witness to small groups and at church, women's groups and stuff. And I told them, I'm like, let's start with how to do this, because there's right ways and wrong ways to do this. And it was very Socratic method-ish. Let's start them thinking. How do you get them thinking and questioning what they believe? Because I'll tell you what not to do. I call it what you call the steamroller. You call it the steamroller. I called it except I put it on the Christian. It was the flamethrower. Like, you don't want to flamethrower them, guys.
Yeah, that's like slash and burn agriculture. You leave nothing but smoke and charred embers in your wake.
You have all this head knowledge, and you want to just throw it at them at the same, all at once, and you overwhelm them, and you miss that opportunity.
Yeah.
Stop, slow down, ask them questions.
Right.
Get them thinking. What you would say, put a stone in your shoe. This is how I would recommend people start, because all the time me and Doreen get asked, how do I witness to my loved one? How do I reach them? And most of my advice is centered around what you just said. You don't want to just go straight to, you're a sinner, you need Jesus. That is all true. But if you carefully place it, if somebody's at a level 2 and you're at a level 8, you got to come to their level 2 sometimes, and just kind of work with them on that, and that comes with asking questions and gathering information, which is a lot of the Columbo tactic, which I want to ask you about next.
Before you get to that, I just wanted to make an observation here, because John chapter 4, Jesus is talking with the woman at the well. And as you mentioned, it's true that we're sinners, we need Christ. Okay, yeah, that is true, but it's inelegant. All right. Putting it that way is not going to probably jar anyone into think, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or they're going to make them mad at you. But look at Jesus with the woman at the well and how carefully he maneuvers in conversations with her. He's coy with her. Mm-hmm. He makes certain statements about himself that get her thinking, that are provocative. If you would have asked of me, I would have given you living water. Oh, really? Well, okay. So now he's in that situation. He's not asking questions. Mm-hmm. He's although he does in many others. He asks more than 300 questions in the Gospels. But in that situation, I'm just asking people to look how carefully he's maneuvering with that unique woman. Chapter before with Nicodemus, he's very blunt. He's very forceful. He's straightforward. Mm-hmm. With the woman at the well, he's coy. He's shrewd. He's careful. He's maneuvering. And then he says, "Go get your husband." And she said, ain't got no husband. He says, "You're right. You've had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with is not your husband." Okay, now what's that speaking to? That's speaking to the moral issue. Mm-hmm. He didn't say you're a dirty, filthy little sinner.
Yeah.
He, in so many words, he did get to that issue, but he did so in a much more careful, elegant way that was persuasive for her circumstances. And that's what we're getting at. Yes.
Because I think that we all have this, some of us, and whenever we kind of take a step back and reflect and realize there is not a one size fits all.
Right.
to witness, to talk to people, to share your faith, to get them to think, whatever it is, to put a stone in their shoe, so to speak.
Right.
And you have to kind of meet people and ask those questions. For me, that comes incredibly naturally.
Yeah.
To the point where it's annoying that I ask so many questions
Well,
sometimes.
people got annoyed at Columbo too. You know, Melissa, there's this great verse in Colossians chapter 4. Paul says, conduct yourself with wisdom towards outsiders,
Mm-hmm.
making the most of the opportunity. Okay, so first he says, be smart.
Yeah.
Then he says, let your speech always be with grace as though seasoned with salt. So he says, be smart. Then he says, be nice. Oh, that's all right. That's what a concept, right? But then he says, so that you know how to respond to each person. So you know how to respond to each person. So be smart, be nice, but be tactical. And this is what the point I was making with Jesus, with the woman at the well versus Nicodemus in the chapter before. He's responding uniquely to the unique person and the unique circumstance.
Like it. I love how that's broken down. And you do talk about that in your book.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I saw the smile there when I started citing it. Oh, she
yeah,
remembers.
I knew.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you before we get into the Columbo tactics. So is this assuming that people are Christian, of course, and they know they have some information about the essentials of the Christian faith, that they have, some tools in their tool belt, so to speak. So they already have an understanding of what the Christian faith is and what the holes in the other person's argument are? Or do we have to have a lot of head knowledge? Where can somebody be in their Christian walk in order to apply these tactics?
Okay, I have the great question, and I have a simple answer to that, Melissa. It's the promise I make to every audience whenever I speak, and it's in the foreword to the book, which wasn't in the original, by the way, the foreword, but I make the promise that I am going to give them a game plan that will allow them to converse with confidence in any situation, no matter how little they know, or how knowledgeable or aggressive or even obnoxious the other person happens to be. So the point here, to begin to get into play, you don't need to know anything special. Now, yes, this is written for Christians to get into play with non-Christians. And so if you're a Christian, you at least know what's required to become a Christian because you had to apply that to your own life. So you have the core of the gospel message. We're in trouble. God established a rescue plan. He became a man himself to rescue us. And he did that by what he did, the way he lived his life and the way he died. That makes it possible for us to be reunited with God, and reconciled with God. I mean, that's pretty basic. Now, you don't have to use my words. Your words are fine, anybody's words, as long as we get the substance there, how God rescues us through Christ. That's how we got rescued, okay? Not by our works, but by his grace. That's the basic. All Christians know that if they're real Christians. Simple. Now, how do you move forward? And my point here is to get rolling. To become effective, to begin to be effective, I should say, you don't need to know any theology, advanced theology. You don't need to know any apologetics. You don't need to know any philosophy, because the initial steps of the game plan are questions you're asking to get the kind of information that will help you maybe to move to the next steps. Part of what I've discovered here in my own experience and with others who have used it, many have told me this, that even the initial steps, the first two parts of the three-part game plan, which are innocuous ways of gathering some basic information from other people. We're not taking a stand. We're not advancing our view. We're not even disagreeing with anybody else. But just taking those two steps can the Holy Spirit uses that to have an impact on people. It's unbelievable what God does, even when we're in a passive mode when we use these first two steps. So simply put, the answer to your question is, you don't have to know anything, but that you're a Christian and how you became a Christian, and then the rest of your education, you're going to get in the process of using the game plan.
It's like it's just people skills. It's learning how to be a good conversation starter and a good listener.
That's right. And by the way, the two are connected. If you want to be a good conversationalist, you ask questions and listen.
Yes.
People will think, man, she's such a good conversationalist when they're doing all the talking, right? But you've engaged them in a meaningful way and you're paying attention to what they're saying, which incidentally is an important part of the equation.
Yeah.
If we ask the questions, we're not listening to the answers, then we're missing the boat.
Yes.
We have to pay attention because this is where we're going to get the kind of information that will help us to know where to go next, or even if to go next in a conversation. I don't think all conversations are divine appointments. No, that's my view. Sometimes we're just ships passing in the night, but the questions allow you to get a sense of the lay of the land.
Yeah, I can attest to that. I think that's a good point. So for the Columbo tactic, so if you're in, this is the tactic that came very naturally to me because I love Columbo. I mean, my dad used to watch it all the time. It was always on.
That's what young people always say. I love Columbo because my dad used to watch it all the time.
And my dad's a retired police officer. So he always had, the History Channel on. He had Columbo. He has all these old shows on.
Sure.
And I remember that. So whenever you use him as a metaphor to kind of show how that works, I understood that because he walks in and he's just gathering information. He's like, I don't understand this though.
Something about this thing bothers me,
Yeah.
Something about this thing bothers me, how he does that.
Hold on a second. And then he comes in with the zinger, and it's because he's gathered all that information. And so what does that look like? Can you tell us how you would use that in a practical way? You do give, one of my favorite things that you do is that you give examples, stories, if you will, of how you've used these. I love that. I think that really shows and breaks down how you did it.
Yeah.
So for the sake of this interview though, how
they're real stories too. I didn't make any of those up. I have a bunch more.
I remember some of them from the old book. Yeah.
So let's just say, for example, one conversation that I talk about in the book is a waitress that was serving me at a restaurant in Seattle, and she says, all religions are basically the same. Okay, so she makes this claim. Now, this is a way of relativizing the Christian's claim that Christianity is unique and you need to believe in Christ and not any old thing. Okay, now I hadn't even made that statement to her yet, but she just starts out with this. So she's taken charge and she's telling me what the lay of the land is like. All religions are basically the same. Now, I think the impulse for some Christians is to say, well, no, actually, Jesus is unique. All religions are different from each other, blah, 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 blah. But notice at that point, the Christian is preaching to the non-Christian and contradicting the non-Christian. So preaching and contradicting are both things that, they may be helpful in certain circumstances, but they have a negative edge to them. All right. And it also puts a lot of pressure on the Christian. So here's what I didn't do that. I used a tactical approach. She said, all religions are basically the same. And I said, oh, really? In what way?
Simple.
Now, it was very, very simple. And it was a genuine request for more information. Yeah. If she thinks that religions have fundamental foundational similarities that are the things that really matter, not the differences, then she must have a fairly clear idea about what those similarities are. Now, I happen to know different. I know that religions are wildly diverse and they contradict each other at critical points. Some teach that God is personal, some teach that God is not personal. Well, he's either one or the other. If he exists, he can't be both. And that's foundational to the worldview. Some teach it's irrelevant whether God exists. That's Buddhism. But God is irrelevant in Buddhism. And so anyway, I know that she's making a mistake in her assertion, but instead of correcting her, I just simply ask her to clarify. And so the first step of Columbo is to gather information, especially information that clarifies what the other person is saying.
Yes.
I'll tell you what happened in this particular circumstance. It's a very simple thing. Bang, she fires at me and I just say, help me understand that. What do you mean by that? Is a version of the question. How are they all basically the same? What happened is she went mute. She was dumbstruck. She stood there with the coffee pot in her hand and she had nothing to say. And she was standing there so long, speechless, though I hadn't tried to embarrass her, that I started helping her out a little bit. Well, maybe they all believe in this or that, but she had no idea in what way they're basically the same. Now, there's a secret here. There's an insight. And the insight is that folks oftentimes will repeat slogans that they have heard, that they have found to be effective to silence the Christian, to stonewall the Christian in some way. But they're not anything they've ever really thought about for themselves. So when you ask for clarification, you get what I call, and here's a 60s alert here, the Simon and Garfunkel response. Remember that song, The Sounds of Silence,
Yes.
And then you get the sounds of silence. And so there's just one example, though, like you asked me, how do you deal with that? One example of how there's a challenge that's offered, and my response is in the form of a question asking for more information. Now, it might be that she would have given me more information.
Yes.
Okay? In this case, that she didn't. But fine. Once she gives me more information, I might have more questions for clarification's sake of the additional things she said.
Yes.
So the key here is I want to get the lay of the land as much as possible. Yeah. All right? I want intel. And so I want to keep drawing them out, letting them explain their view so I get as clear an understanding as possible. This accomplishes two things. It protects me from misrepresenting their view, which is called a straw man fallacy, which is bad thinking and it's bad manners, all right? But it also forces them to be more clear about their own view. And what I find is people are not very clear on their own views, and their views get traction because of their ambiguity. So when I start asking for clarification, that's when they have to think about it a little bit. And this is where sometimes the Holy Spirit will do something that you didn't intend because they're beginning to realize maybe their view isn't as good as they thought it was.
You put a stone in their shoe.
There you go. Why'd you touch your nose on that one? I don't know.
Because it's my point I'm making for you.
Oh, is that a millennial thing there? Okay, just checking. I'm out of touch
I'm so glad you think I'm a millennial.
I don't know. Well, I don't even know what a millennial is. So I just had somebody that's a lot younger than me. So
I'm bouncing off what you just said with all of that. You mentioned something I thought really stuck with me. I loved this. This is possibly one of my favorite things you mentioned. It's basically mapping out landmines.
Yeah.
So it's on page 64. And you're talking about whenever you're asking questions, the purpose of doing that, it's almost like if you were to see a mental map of people's, this is how I understood it. Yeah. If you were to see a mental map of somebody's objections to Christianity or pitfalls or whatever they are, you're basically going at them with as much information as you can so you can see their map. You can see their mental map.
Yeah, sure.
Where their landmines are.
Think of it this way. When you get in a conversation with somebody that you don't know that well, or even somebody that you know fairly well, but you have not talked about these kinds of things, they're kind of a blank slate. And it's very easy to make wrong assumptions, okay? So the illustration in the book was a conversation that I had with a guy named John on an airplane. And we're chatting together, and he's asking what I'm doing, and I mentioned I'm going to an event or something, and so I immediately am identifying myself to him as a Christian. Pardon me. He says to me then, "I'm not a Christian." Oh, okay. Is that good information for me to have?
Yes.
Yes, it is. Okay. Then he says, and now I don't know why he's not a Christian. Okay. But he's letting me know he's not one. So he must have some reasons because he's being deliberate about this information. Why is he not a Christian? Well, if I just move forward here without knowing the answer or getting an idea of the answer to that question, I'm in a sense shooting blind, right? It's like charging over the top of the hill and not knowing what's on the other side to face you. You don't have the intel that you need to go forward effectively. So so he keeps talking though, and I'm asking questions, whatever, using my game plan. But he says, "I used to be a Christian, but I'm not anymore." Is that good information?
Yes.
Oh yeah. Then he says, "Actually, I used to be a preacher's kid." And I said, "John, now here's my question for clarification. John, how'd you used to be a preacher's kid? Did your dad die?" And he said, "No, my dad didn't die. My dad's no longer a preacher anymore." Oh, okay. In fact, my dad's no longer a Christian.
Hmm.
Ah, is that good information for me?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So do you think there's any baggage sitting next to me here on the
Mhm.
airplane? Absolutely. And see, if I had just kind of plowed forward with the simple gospel or whatever, here's how he would have responded. I've been there and I've done that and it hurt.
Yes.
Okay. So here now though, and this goes back to your opening comment, I'm getting kind of a mental picture of the spiritual topography of John, and I realize there are landmines out there.
Yes.
And now I'm able to be more careful to maneuver around the landmines. And as it turned out, John told me a story, and it was not a pretty one. And he was very emotionally invested in his hostility towards Christianity because of what had happened in his family. And then he said to me, you know, people like you, like Christians, would normally be really angry at a person like me, given what I've just said. But
Huh.
you're not angry at me, and I appreciate that. Oh my goodness. Do you think just the fact that I listened to him patiently
Yeah.
without attacking him, even though I was a Christian, might just put a little stone in his shoe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Now, as it turned out, I ended up walking off the plane with his email in my pocket, and so that's trust, right? I was able to send him an article that he had asked for that I'd written. But this just illustrates the point that you were making, that when you ask questions and you just gather the information, you're not plowing forward blindly, blundering about, wrecking things, making a mess of things. You're patiently listening, gathering the information you need so you know how you can proceed in the next step.
Yes. So my next question for you on this would be, when you give this information, when you give that advice, do you ever have people who disagree as far as like harvesting and gardening? So they say, no, we should always give the gospel in every conversation. And
Oh yeah, I do
yeah,
have people. In fact, some very famous people have given me a tongue lashing on that issue. People who your listeners would recognize. But I don't want to speak ill of them. I just
yeah,
look at, there are gardeners and harvesters. Okay,
yeah,
and I just today, this morning, finished an article on gardening and harvesting. Okay, it's
yeah,
going out in our bi-monthly solid ground that's going out. So it'll be January 1st. This one goes out. Are you a gardener or are you a harvester? And I
yeah,
say at the end, because I'm making the case for gardening versus harvesting.
yeah,
And I say at the end, you know, if you've read this piece so far and you're really bugged and you think I'm letting people off too easily, I'm not getting to the meat of the matter quickly enough, you're probably a harvester. Good for you. I'm glad you are. We need you.
yeah.
However, I say, but if you're reading this and you're saying to yourself, man, I like this, I can do that, that encourages me, you are probably a gardener like me.
Well,
And I think most Christians are gardeners, not harvesters.
I agree with that. I think it just kind of dawned on me with a harvester. It's almost like they need the gardeners and the gardeners need the harvesters.
Absolutely.
But a harvester, for example, shouldn't miss out on their social cue, so to speak, on when to garden. And gardeners shouldn't miss out on their social cue when it's ready to harvest. So it's
That's
like
right.
they both need to know how to do both. But I tend to agree with you that most of the time, in my experience, not to, I am in the same boat with you. When it comes to actually leading somebody directly to Christ, that is a rarity. It's a wonderful opportunity when you get that. But my email's filled with people asking questions, wanting
Hmm.
to know more, or the videos that I make are about, answering tough questions. We're gardening. We're
Yeah.
doing that work.
Let me throw something else out here that is also will be counterintuitive to many people in light of our present way of looking at that.
Mm-hmm.
But they can look back on their own life and decide whether on lives and decide whether I'm onto something here. So here's a controversial statement. Most people do not need to be led to Christ. And what I mean by that, the emphasis is on the led. They need Christ, but there are a massive number of people who become Christians based on the preaching of the word, and not because somebody's tapping them on the shoulder and asking them to pray a prayer.
Mm-hmm.
They are turning to Christ in their heart, and they are surrendering themselves to Christ based on the preachment of the word, not on somebody challenging them to receive Christ. Now, I'm not putting that down.
Yeah.
I'm just simply saying, I know there are a lot of people that are listening right now that are saying, well, you know what? Now I think about it, nobody prayed with me to receive Christ. I just knelt down by my bed and prayed.
Yeah.
I just asked Christ to come into my life. I called out to God and he rescued me. And then I began, and some of them that I've talked to said, I didn't even know any other Christians. In fact, I was anxious to meet real Christians because I felt I was the only one around in my neighborhood.
Yeah. That reminds me of Doreen. Yeah.
Yeah, so here you've got, and when I became a follower of Christ, it was September 28th, 1973. My brother was there with me, but I told him, he started to witness to me, and I said, Mark, you don't need to do that anymore. I'm already ready to receive Christ. I want to become a Christian. Now, I suspect that when I said that to him and I prayed the prayer, I didn't become a Christian then. I think I already was a Christian.
Yeah.
I think I already was believing in Jesus, and I was kind of going through the formality of a prayer. Think about the Pentecost Sunday. There is Peter preaching the resurrection, and Jesus to the crowd. Does Peter lead them in the sinner's prayer? No. He says, what should we do? He says, repent and be baptized is what he says. Change your mind. Be baptized. Follow Christ, essentially. Receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. So when we see it, the motif in the New Testament is a communication of the truth,
mm-hmm.
and people who are listening then respond. We have no examples that I know of anyone being challenged to receive Christ in the New Testament. The closest thing to an altar call is a baptism, but those people are already believers at that point. So I'm not saying this to discourage people from praying the sinner's prayer with someone.
Mm-hmm.
I am saying this to encourage Christians that that's not the magic moment necessarily. God works in a lot of different ways, and many people come to Christ because of the faithful communication of the truth, but they come to Christ as God draws them into the kingdom.
It's God's sovereignty too.
Exactly.
Yes. So
exactly.
that somebody asked me one time why I don't, almost like I don't feel like an urgency to go out and I do as a Christian, I want everybody to know the gospel, but why don't I lose sleep at night about it? And I'm like, God's sovereignty. Yeah. And they're like, that's just too simple. And I'm like, well, that's what gives me comfort and peace.
Let me suggest something. When they say that's too simple, here's my question. What's too simple about it?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, notice just this is pedagogy in our conversation here. This is taking the tactical approach and applying it right here in the circumstance. Mm-hmm. Okay. I appreciate what you were saying, your own point of view there, but that would be an appropriate place to ask somebody what's too simple about it.
Yeah.
And then they have to explain why a confidence in God's sovereignty is not enough.
Yeah.
That's going to be hard to do.
Yeah, because then it puts it all on us. And that's what takes the load off.
Yeah.
Is that it's not on us. It's him. He's the one who does this. It's all on him, not me.
Exactly. The way I put it in the book is it may be our task, but it's God's problem. Evangelism, engaging, this is our task. It's what we're supposed to do. But that person is God's concern. He's more concerned about them than we are. And that's why we could do a little gardening, and then we move on from the circumstance and maybe never see them again, trusting them to the sovereignty of God, because he is in charge of the whole operation after all, not me.
So you have 3 parts to the Columbo tactic.
Right.
And each part is initiated differently.
Right.
In part 2, you have something, well, you have 2 things, but one of them that I found pretty interesting was the suicide tactic.
Mm-hmm.
Real briefly, we have about 5 minutes or so. Can you explain the suicide tactic? Because I think that this is something where people forget the fallacy, the logical fallacies that people kind of fall.
Sure. The suicide tactic falls in the second part of the book, which is titled Finding the Flaw. The first part is the game plan, Columbo, the 3 parts of that game plan, then finding the flaw, because the third part of the plan is to use Columbo to make a point, use questions to make a point. Well, one point you might want to be making is there's something wrong with their ideas. And so first you have to find out what's wrong with the idea before you can employ questions to help a person see that. The suicide tactic is meant to help you see that some points of view actually defeat themselves.
Yeah.
They commit hara-kiri, and you don't have to do any work, but just points it out. And so when people say, well, there's no truth, we could give an argument that's, there you go, bada boom.
Yeah.
That's a question. Is that true? See, because if it's false, it's false. But if the statement is true, it's also false because it's self-refuting.
Yes.
There is no way the statement can be true. It is necessarily false. It's self-contradictory, okay? And so there are variations of the suicide tactic. There are 3 or 4 different variations of it. I'll give you another illustration of practical suicide, and that is a conversation I had with a guy named Gil, who was arguing with me about, well, we were having a friendly discussion about some moral issues, and he got my point of view, and he said, you Christians start judging people, You're nice people, but then you start to judge. Now I'm going to ask a question to kind of set this up a little bit better for me. I said, Gil, what's wrong with that? I didn't say it quite like that, but notice the point. What's wrong with that, Gil? And he said, well, it's wrong to judge. Okay, that's what I'm after. I wanted to make the statement because now in making the statement, he's just made a what? He's made a judgment, okay? Yes. So instead of saying, aha, gotcha, you just made a judgment against me. That's contradictory. Your view commits suicide. Well, that would be true, but inelegant and a lot more work than is needed.
Yeah.
Here's what I said instead. I said, Gil, if it's wrong to judge, then why, notice the question, why are you judging me right now? And that stopped him completely in his tracks. He had never heard anything like that before. And he's scratching his head and mumbling to himself and trying to figure out what happened. But what happened is I just pointed out that he was doing the very thing he was telling me not to do. And this kind of thing happens all the time. And I exploited it with a simple question. So then he amended his point. He said, okay, maybe it's okay to judge, but you can't push your morality on someone else. All right, he thought he'd improved his situation. So I asked another.
Your morality on me?
Yeah, well, exactly. First, I asked a clarification question. Yeah. I said, is that your morality, Gil, what you just said? And he said, yes, it is. Like, so blindly, he didn't realize what was going to happen next. Then I said, then why are you pushing it on me right now? Stopped his tracks again, scratching his head, mumbling. He makes a couple of false starts and can't get going. And finally he says, it's not fair. I said, what do you mean it's not fair? He said, well, I can't find a way to say it which it sounds right. I said, Gil, it doesn't sound right because you're doing the very thing you're telling me not to do. Okay? And there's no way around that, So there's an example of the suicide tactic in play on something very simple. When people say, don't push your morality on me.
Yes.
Well, that's their morality. Might be good to ask that clarification question, then ask them if you don't think it's right to push your morality, then why are you doing it?
Mm-hmm.
Huh?
Yeah.
Well, what you just said just then. Now, you might have to explain it to them because a lot of people, I'm telling you, they don't realize they're doing this. And they are so out of touch with that sometimes it takes a little explaining for them to see what they're actually doing.
And the reason why I wanted you to expand on that, and you did it beautifully, is our ministry, my ministry, is to ex-New Agers, to New Agers. Yeah. And this is, you've dealt with them before, I'm sure, where these beliefs just kind of, they eat themselves.
Yes.
And you don't realize it. You don't realize that there's pitfalls there to these beliefs.
Yeah.
And so when people are asking, hey, how do I witness to my New Age cousin or whoever it is, well, the first thing you want them to do is to define what they believe really clearly.
Yeah, sure. I had another conversation with a Seattle waitress just earlier this year, and she was a New Ager. She was all buoyant in the morning. I'm trying to have my first cup of coffee, and I just did not want to talk about God or anything. But she's all over me, chitter chatter, this and that. And then I told her, she asked me what I was doing. Okay, I'm going to teach in a church here in an hour or so. Oh, that's wonderful. I said, really? Are you a Christian? Oh, no. But and then she explained some of her New Age views. Now, remember, I wasn't interested in talking at all with her. Before my first cup of coffee, I'm an atheist, so I'm still trying to get my bearings. And but then she's saying these things that are kind of, well, the universe takes care of me. I said, how can the universe take care of you? The universe isn't a person. Well, God takes care of me. Well, is the universe God? The universe is God. Well, is the universe personal or impersonal? And so, what I'm just asking these questions because there's this torrent of New Age, and pardon the way of putting it, but New Age nonsense that's coming out of her head. And so I'm just asking her questions about it. And so it seemed to me I'm not having any impact on her whatsoever. So I just kind of let the conversation die a natural death, and off she went. And then a few minutes later, she came up to me to refill my coffee, and she says, that was a really interesting conversation. Nobody has ever asked me questions like that before. And you really got me thinking. It was amazing. And I said to her, well, if we had more time, I'd ask you more questions that'll get you thinking about more things. I kind of was a friendly.
Yeah.
I ended up leaving a copy of The Story of Reality with her, and she was really, really happy to get that.
Speaking of Story of Reality, I read that too.
This wasn't a shameless plug, but thank you.
Let me put a shameless plug to your book. Because this is very C.S. Lewis-y. If you want to know the worldview of Christianity in a really simple way, I actually was going to tell people about this book before we closed, but this is a very straightforward, well-written explanation of the Christian worldview compared to others. And why, from A to B. So I love, Greg, I love how you connect dots, the way that you write. It's well written. It's very intelligent stuff, but you explain it in a way that people can understand it. And that's just what we're looking for.
Well, thank you. My goal is to throw the ball so people can catch it. That's what I try to do. So
see, that's another thing. It's a Gregism, like you have, ways of putting things, that people understand. And I did want to talk about Story of Reality and just tell you guys, go out and grab this. It is almost Christmas time. These books would make amazing Christmas presents. Treat yourself. Every Christian needs to have this book on their bookshelf. I have never read anything quite like this, where it displays it in a simplistic way on how to talk to people. It's people skills. It's how to have, a game plan on how to discuss what you believe in an effective way. And everybody's heard me say that. And if there was ever a book written about it that I would recommend, this would be it. So go out and grab yourself a copy on Amazon, leave a review. And yeah, Greg, I just want to thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking with me. I know Doreen couldn't be here, and I know she said she missed this, but this has been awesome and amazing. And thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Give my best to Doreen, and you guys are doing an amazing job. And this is one of the most comfortable and pleasant conversations that I could have in a circumstance like that. You're great. You're just fabulous. And so is Doreen. I love the time we spent last time. It was great to be able to do this again. And thank you for being so exuberant about the things that I've written and recommending them so aggressively. It's really nice to know I've made an impact in your life and am contributing to both of your magnificent ministries.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Greg.